In this video, I will lead you through the steps for creating your first pivot table. The results won't be very fancy, but you will see how easy it is to get useful information very quickly. I will use the data set that was presented in an earlier video, the one you see here. Each row represents a purchase by a customer from a fictional online retail store. The purchases start in March 2014 and extend through early October of the same year. The data set is of moderate size with 4,000 records. It is set up perfectly for pivot tables with a number of categorical fields on the left and several numeric fields on the right. The company might want to break down any of these numeric fields by any of the categorical fields, such as total spent by customer region and/or purchase time. To start, I will select any cell in the data range and then click the Pivot Table button on the Insert ribbon. Note that the Recommended Pivot Tables button to its right is new to Excel 2013. You can click this button to get an instant pivot table, but it might not be the one you want. I won't illustrate this option here. This opens the dialog box you see, where you must choose the data source and the location for the pivot table. For the data source, you can choose an Excel range or an external data source. For now, I will choose an Excel range. Then Excel guesses at the correct range, and if the active cell is within the data range, as it is here, the guess is usually correct. If necessary, you can change Excel's guess. Note that this range should include the labels in the top row of the dataset. For location, you can place the pivot table on an existing worksheet starting in a designated cell, but you will often choose to place it on a new worksheet, as I will do here. The bottom checkbox is new to Excel 2013. I will ignore it for now. When I click OK, a new worksheet opens, which you can rename and move if you like. For some reason I've never understood, Excel places the new worksheet to the left of the datasheet. I think most people would rather have it to the right of the datasheet, so that's what I will do here. This worksheet contains a blank pivot table on the left and a pivot table fields pane on the right. The fields pane is crucial, so the first thing you should realize is that if it disappears, it is easy to restore. Currently, the active cell is A3, and because it is inside the pivot table, the fields pane is visible. But if I select a cell outside the pivot table, the fields pane disappears. To get it back, all I need to do is select a cell inside the pivot table. You might have also noticed that when a cell in the pivot table is selected, two Pivot Table Tools tabs are visible, the Analyze and Design tabs. Actually, the Analyze tab was called Options in previous versions of Excel, but the functionality is basically the same. The ribbons associated with these tabs contain many useful pivot table options. And most of them will be discussed in later videos. Like the Fields pane, these tabs disappear when the active cell is not inside the pivot table. The Fields pane lists all data fields at the top, and it shows four areas at the bottom: filters, rows, columns, and values. Generally, you place categorical fields in the rows, columns, or filters areas, and you place numeric fields to be summarized in the values area. By the way, if you are coming from a previous version of Excel, you will notice that the titles of three of the areas, rows, columns, and filters, have been condensed slightly, but they function exactly as before. To start, I will check Customer Region and Total Spent in the Fields list. The Categorical Customer Region field automatically goes to the Rows area, and the Total Spent field automatically goes to the Values area, where it is summarized by summing. You can see the results in the pivot table. For example, the total spent for all purchases in the West is slightly more than $384,000, and the total spent in all purchases in all regions is slightly more than $2.6 million. As this example illustrates, when you check fields in the fields list, categorical fields automatically go to the rows area, and numeric fields automatically go to the values area. However, there are other ways to get fields to the areas where you want them. First, you can check a field and then drag it to the area you want. I will check customer gender and then drag it to the columns area. Alternatively, I will uncheck this field and then drag it directly to the columns area. This is the way I prefer to do it, and you probably will too. Either of these methods leads to the pivot table where sum of total spent is broken down by region and gender. For example, the total spent by all male customers in the Midwest is almost $230,000. I now have a pivot table with useful results, but this is just the start. Later videos will illustrate how this pivot table can be modified in a variety of ways.